Welcome to my video. My name is Christopher Houghton Budd. I'm an economic and monetary historian, but I'm also a disruptor. What does that mean? It means that I do things in public spaces, and the idea is to bring about changes in thought or changes in behavior. So I began this when I was 14 years old in Tunbridge Wells, when I ran 2 48-hour fasts on the church steps opposite the town hall to raise money for Oxfam and freedom from hunger. And why did I do that? Because from the age of 14, I have been concerned with what's called the equitable distribution of wealth. That is to say, the inequitable distribution of wealth. So I've been involved in economics all my life, and that meant in particular I was concerned about how to make it practical, not just theoretical. And the way I learned my economics, in fact, was building 30 houses, because if you want to manage multiple independent variables, which is a challenge every economist faces, that's the best way of doing it. Build a house and bring it in on budget. And also my concern is to find a way of working economics which is based on business, but also is universal and not subject Anglo-Saxon capture. So many of my ideas have been about how do we get beyond the Anglo-Saxon mindset, and the key thing about that is to use the arts. My first link to the arts, so to speak, was through building these houses, because then I became involved in architecture, quality of building, also in landscaping. And in that experience, I learned not to oppose quality and quantity, but to see them as two sides of one coin. And in those days, I took my cues from William Morris, who had this idea that things should be both useful and beautiful. For me, economics has always been fun, so I never understood why Thomas Carlyle called it the dismal science in the book he wrote in 1849. I understand why he did that. It was in reaction to Thomas Malthus's idea that population would outstrip resources. But in fact, Thomas Malthus was never right in the first place, and he still hasn't been proven right. The issue in economics is really about equitable distribution of wealth. Do we have enough for everybody? And that depends on how we think about things. For me, I have an Aristotelian background, and the key concept in economics is simply enough. I can't tell you what is enough, you can't tell me what is enough, but if we each follow our own compass, so to speak, overall there will always be enough for our needs. So it's interesting to me that in 1930, John Maynard Keynes, the British economist, he wrote an essay, Essays to My Grandchildren. And in this, he pointed out that our permanent problem is not an economic one. Resources will be available, and this we will find out within 100 years, so about now. So again, it can't be about resources, it has to be about distribution. He also then interestingly said, and when we solve that problem of distribution, we will face another one. We will not know what to do with our leisure time. In fact, he predicted a nervous breakdown on the part of the whole mankind. Maybe that's what we're going through now. So for me, the use of the arts in link with economics is to prove Carlyle wrong and John Maynard Keynes right. And what follows is a run-through of the various artistic media that I've used in my 30 or 40 years as an economist in workshops and in teaching economics in different contexts. I'm going to begin with the use of chalk on black paper. I'm an amateur in this, and I don't claim any particular expertise, and in fact, when I began doing this, my drawings were no more than stick drawings. But in 1992, I met the late American artist Tamara Slaton, and she started to coach me in using chalk on black paper. In fact, I now use only pastels. These happen to be the cheapest pastels you can find, and you find them in a store in Los Angeles. And the secret of black paper, rather than whiteboards or green boards as you used to find in schools, with black, I call it the color of freedom. So when you apply color on black, a whole lot of things happen which simply don't happen on whiteboards or on green boards. So I've got used to taking rolls of black paper with me around the world, and in universities and schools or wherever I'm doing my workshops, the first thing I have to do is unfold rolls of black paper and glue them or magnet them onto the walls, turn off all the PowerPoint, and then I begin my drawing. And in doing this, I have some antecedents, some inspirations. One of them is Joseph Beuys, the German kind of activist artist, and he did many installations and many drawings on blackboards about how he understood economics, the role of capital, the role of money. These you will find in many places, also at the Tate Gallery in London. And he was inspired in turn, as am I, by the work of Rudolf Steiner, who also used black paper with coloured chalks to illustrate his economics lectures way back in 1922. And with Rudolf Steiner, that is my niche market in the professional field of economics. A next area of art that I use is allegorical writing. That means, for example, in my professional life, in working with monetary policy, with central banks and so on, I come to a point where what is understood is clearly not correct. The reality is other than the theory, but people are afraid to go beyond the theory because they're not sure where this will lead them. It becomes too existential. And so to back off from this, to not present it with a problem, I use allegorical writing to write up all my normative ideas so they don't, so to speak, contaminate my professional papers, my scholarly work. And in 2004, I wrote a book called Rare Albion, which is subtitled The Further Adventures of the Wizard of Oz. And this book is about a mythical place, which is England, in the rarefied atmosphere of modern finance. And on that island, this special country, then monetary policy, finance, accounting, all these things are conducted in the way that I think they ought to be, and in fact, one day they will be. But in writing that book, it's just an imagination. So I can say to my colleagues, relax, this doesn't have to happen, but they know perfectly well that I know technically what I'm talking about. So this use of allegorical writing is a great kind of foil to the hard statistical world of modern finance. And in fact, in 2020, I wrote a sequel called Rare Albion 2, in which I focus on the town where I live, Folkestone, but I renamed it Folkestown. And Folkestown is the capital of Rare Albion. So there I looked very closely at the local politics, the local economics, and I invented them on a different level, thinking that one day this book would just be a description of what is actually happening. A third area I work in is exhibitions, and I began doing this about 8 years ago in Folkestone. I began with a simple drawing on the wall of 3 kinds of money, because there was a gap in an exhibition space, so I used it. And I followed that up with a 2-week exhibition taking us through the history of finance. And my reason for doing this initially was because there are many money museums around the world, full of artifacts, full of dates, timelines, and so on. I don't have issues with the artifacts or the timelines. I have issues with the narrative or the explanation. So when I began doing exhibitions, which I did 8 in 2015 in Folkestone, and I've done about 6 since then, my idea was to force me to develop a different narrative. And one day I hope to have a World Finance Museum actually here in Folkestone. Then there are plays. I've often worked with agitprop from my days in the 60s when I was an outside agitator in America. And I've also done a lot of skits in conferences, all built around economics, illustrating economics in a kind of comedy fashion. And then in 2002 or thereabouts, I had an opportunity to give a course at a Faust performance. And Faust has a whole series or whole section about money. And for that conference, I got a whole bunch of young people to perform a play that I wrote the day before. I cast it, I designed the sets, and we did the whole thing on stage within about 3 days. And this put air under my wings as regards playwriting. And so in 2019, I wrote a play overnight at the conference I was giving in Vancouver. And then we cast it the next day. It's 3 men, Keynes, Steiner, and Woodrow Wilson, but I cast them all as women because for me, women have a very important part to play in modern economics. Their absence is the reason where we have all our problems. So we had a run through, and then 3 months later, back in Folkestone, I then I dramatized it, and in 3 weeks with my 3 actors, we put it on in the local arts centre. But by then they decided it was going to be a chat show, and it turned out to be a discussion between Keynes and Steiner against Woodrow Wilson about how the end of the World War One came about. And Steiner and Keynes had the same ideas, but they didn't like what Woodrow Wilson did. But we used this play. It was very chummy. It was a chat show. It wasn't adversarial like it became in subsequent history. And I think this is one of the things you can do with the arts and with plays. You can get yourself into a space which is not them and us, either or, which is what bedevils most of modern economics. And then there's my work in teaching financial literacy. This for me is the most important thing, and it should begin in high schools at the age 14 if younger. The minute you can do geometry, algebra, compound interest, you can understand bookkeeping. But the way I do this is again using artistic media, chalk on black paper, but the trick is to get the students to shout out everything they know about money. This I then write on my black sheet, and then we organize it in 3 different ways according to the different types of money. And I just underline the different words in red, blue, and yellow as they tell me to do so. The effect is you cannot shout without being fully attentive and sitting up in your seat. So I've got my audience, and everything on the wall comes from them and nothing from me. So they are fully engaged. And part of that course is to pass around a whole series of banknotes from around the world. And after 10 minutes observation, I get them to draw on black paper the obverse and reverse of money for the world. And again, this is a wonderful thing to do because they are so engaged, they have so many ideas, and they're so knowledgeable. It puts professionals to shame. And I have many of these pictures. In fact, I have over 600 2-meter wide black images from around the world over the last 30 years in my archive. And then lastly is my latest foray into the arts, which I call streetscape illustration. Where I live in Folkestone, there's a particular part of town right by the sea, which in my view was the centre and should be the centre. But now it's occupied by a very large car park and a road junction. So just where the pedestrians should be walking freely through this part of town, they have to navigate traffic and car park and the cars that come with it. And so my idea was to turn this into a plaza. It still is my idea. And in this triennial, in the 2021 triennial at Folkestone, the curator Lewis Biggs commissioned me to create an artwork which is 12 light posts which simply stand in a circle around this junction. And the idea is they ask the question, why is this not a plaza? Why are the pedestrians not given priority? This is the harbour side of a seaside town. And in this way, I use the arts, not so much for the sake of the arts, but to prompt a conversation, which will continue when the artwork has removed itself or been moved to some other part of the world. And the idea there is to use the arts to kind of bring into being something which begins only in imagination. And eventually, that's what I believe, politicians and market operators will follow what comes out of the imagination. That's what's so important for art in economics. You can go to a realm which is not yet pragmatic. You can have lots of flights of fancy, and gradually you can bring something down to earth, which in fact ticks all the boxes of finance and of practicality. But this is not something you can ask a business person to think up or a district councillor. This can only come from an imaginative economist, an economist who's an artist and who is quite happy to be disruptive. That's why my tag is Disruptive of Tunbridge Wells, where I grew up. Thank you.